to say that most wine consumption in America or anywhere, really about say 90% of it, it's really about the hedonism, right? It goes back to the Greeks and earlier. I mean, wine consumption can date all the way back to the ancient Egyptians. And I like to say that, you know, about 90% of it is hedonistic, but the other 10% is not. It's academic, it's tasting. So this is to separate drinking from tasting, and that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. Is not really the drinking of it, the consumption of it, but really the appreciation of it and how to do that and what to look for. Really, how do we build value in our experiences when we're doing that? So what is that? So when I'm drinking wine, where you drink it is important. You know, it's a full sensory experience. It's not just about the taste. It's how the wine looks in the glass. It generally is how the wine smells. So you can tell a lot about how that's really a big part of it is the smelling of it. There are about at least 1,200 different nasal receptors in your brain for detecting of wine aromas, whereas there's only about 5 on your palate that have been proven, and there's as many as 5,000 to be conjectured to be out there. So that's 5,000 or at least 1,200 proven distinct flavors that we can get out of. We can smell. Humans can smell. It's even more for something like a dog or something like that. But anyway, so when we're tasting wine, we first look at we taste with our eyes. We look at the color of the glass or the color of the wine itself. The best way really to assess wine is to actually take a piece of paper or something like this and hold the wine against a white backdrop, and that way you can look at both. You can sort of see the inner and outer of the wine. That is the rim versus the core. And that about the rim, it would be easier to do this if I were in person, but basically that when you stretch the wine out on the glass, that is outside of the wine. Let's see if I can sort of do this. Sort of like that. It's sort of what falls around the outside. And then does that have a distinct difference between what's on the outside versus the inside, the rim versus the core? That's sight. We first taste with our eyes, and then of course we're smelling. There's an initial sort of smell, and then as you swirl the glass, more and more aromas will emerge. The wine will actually change differently. It will change over time, and more and more aroma will start to come out of the glass. And then of course we sip. And there is a taste. There's an initial taste on the front of the palate, the mid palate as it sort of washes over you. There's the back palate, and then after you swallowed, and this is an important part of it, is the finish. And the finish is not necessarily something that you picked up at the back of your palate, but it's something that emerges over time that happens long after you swallowed. And if a better quality wine, it will have a longer finish. It will continue to do things long after you've swallowed the wine, and so that's something to just kind of basically just something to pay attention to while you're tasting, and that these things will become more and more apparent the more you taste. There's really no substitute for just going to tastings and trying things, and unfortunately doing a little bit of reading. It's an essential part of the tasting process is doing a little bit of reading and finding a little background of that. Now you don't have to read a tremendous amount of literature. Sometimes it can just be helpful to read the back of the label, and we can talk about some labels are more helpful than others, and that's something to pay attention to when you're shopping. We'll get down to that. We'll come back to that a little later. But when changing, and that's important. So changing gears a little bit. So at its core, really, wine is about place. Wine is been talked about in lots of different ways, both sort of poetically and sort of flowery. But the best wines really are a function of where they're from. They're tied to the people that are making them. They're not just what type of soil that is grown under. It's the orientation of the hillside. It's the way the sun hits the hillside. It's the wind that comes through it. It is also the climactic days, the number the average temperature from day to day. And then I think more controversially, there is this idea that is tied to terroir, or is that wine is about the people. Terroir is tied to the people who are making it, the personality of the winemaker, of the culture of the town, if you will, of the place where it's coming from. That is inextricably tied to the flavor of the wine. And now we're getting a little more frou-frou, but I certainly kind of come of that to that opinion, that really the taste, you get different tastes on the debate depending on who's making it and where it's coming from, and not just as a physical function of chemistry, but of personality involved with it, who's making it. But I mean, that's the more romantic side of wine. There is this other side that is wine is a commodity, that it is of course tied to agriculture. It's tied to economics, tariffs. There's been a lot in the news about wine tariffs, of course. Climate change affects it, and then of course there's always the price point. I mean, really, in some ways, the best wines are prohibitively expensive, and this is tricky. And so we are all ourselves buyers of wine in various capacities, and some people choose to take a very commodity driven aspect when thinking about wine. They don't particularly, and different types of retailers do this more or less. One of them being one that I think of that thinks of wine very much in this way is Costco. They sort of think of wine as really just one more product on their shelf, and not really anything that is romantic. They are looking at, it is very much about sales statistics, what is selling, and how cheaply they can buy it for, and how cheaply they can sell it to you for, so that you get into their stores and you make that so that they look good and they have a lower price point. That kind of loses some of the romance for a lot of people, certainly, but it doesn't stop people from shopping there. Certainly, I'm guilty of going there from time to time as well. I'm sure we all are. But we have to think about it in terms of we should be thinking about it as a commodity, but not just a romantic. And what we're trying to do is, when we're buying wine, we're trying to maximize our overall experience. We're trying to spend as little amount of money and try to maximize the most amount of experience that we can get out of it. And there's a particular term that people in the trade, and not just in the trade, but wine connoisseurs and people, collectors, and any real enthusiasts of wine really like to refer to, and that's quality to price ratio, or QPR. And you'll see that term used around a lot on the sort of the Reddit boards or the online boards when people are talking about wine. You'll see people throw out things like, what great little Rhone wine, paid $10 for it, great QPR. And that's sort of a catch-all term to sort of mean quality to price ratio. I paid X amount of dollars for it, and I felt like I got a really good experience out of it. And I think that's fundamental to when you're really getting into wine, when you're really thinking about buying it. That's really what you're looking for. You're looking for the best bottle of wine. At least I am, unless you have copious amounts of money and you just are looking to spend any amount of money for it. But I don't think anybody here is really looking for it. Even the best people with the most unlimited budgets are still looking for a deal. So there we have it. And so where was it? So how do we find this value? How do we know? How do we look for value? And how are we able to assess it when the industry is somewhat opaque? And it's not always that simple. You don't know what we're paying for. We don't know how, and we don't know whether you were getting fleeced or not. So I'm just kind of going to go through, I guess, briefly. When we're shopping at a restaurant, and then also when we're going to do kind of like talk about the overview of the Massachusetts market. That is the retail market. So when you're looking at a wine list, I mean, we've been to a wine list, sometimes they can be rather long and sometimes they can be rather short. I mean, so sometimes you'll go to that big steakhouse and they'll plop down sort of like a tome-like sort of thing. The most famous example of this is Bern's Steakhouse in Tampa, Florida. Just raise your hand if you've been to Bern's Steakhouse or something. I just want to see. Does anybody know about this? No. So Bern's is this legendary steakhouse in Tampa, Florida, where they have a gigantic wine list. They have a separate facility where they will do it, and you'll come in and you can literally peruse this thing all night if you wanted to. But they've got an incredible collection. They've been doing it since, I think they've been building our collection since the 1960s, and so it's an absolutely wild experience. If you're ever down there, I totally recommend you check it out. And this is going to sound kind of basic, but this is important. I think when a lot of people are shy about this, when they're talking to their waiter, is it's good to consult your waiter. I mean, it's really great to and if your waiter, you'll be able to talk to them within 2 seconds about whether or not they're knowledgeable, whether it's their first day on the job. And if they don't, it's totally fine to ask if they have a sommelier on staff or if there's a manager, and just to get a sense if they're passionate about this subject. It becomes pretty clear whether, when you're talking to somebody in that wait staff position, if they are tasting with it, and will reflect positively or negatively, I think, on the restaurant, if they're taking the time to train their staff and to talk eloquently about these wines on their list, whether it's by the glass or they're doing by the bottle. That I think is actually something that's kind of funny. That a lot of people actually don't really take the time to do that. What do you plan on eating when you're doing this? The old days we would say, of course, the old adage is you'd have white with chicken or fish, or you'd have red with game or sort of or meat or something. Those rules, I think, are really getting thrown out the door. There's lots of adventurous pairings you can do. I encourage you guys to try like an Alsatian white with a really voluptuous Grand Cru Alsace white with a ribeye steak. It has a certain sort of voluptuousness to the wine and can match the weight of the meat. And there's a really sort of searing acidity that will both sort of cut through the fat of it. Of the steak. You can also, if you've never tried it, I highly recommend doing sparkling wine with anything deep fried, like fried and fizz is a classic sort of pairing. And if you want it, we could probably spend an entire class on pairing. But there's a book that I highly recommend called Pairing with the Masters. And this will kind of take you through, just sort of generally speaking, different concepts of how to pair food and wine. And that is, when we do think about pairing wine, we're often thinking about it in terms of a one-to-one. The traditional way was to think about it sort of as a complementary aspect. The wine matched the food in very kind of basic ways. But with pairing, it's really evolved into a much more sort of expansive experience. You can cleanse, the wine can act as a cleanser. The wine can act as a transformer. It can really actually change the way the food is perceived in your mouth, and it can also change the way the wine is perceived simultaneously. The idea is that we can play around with wine as a way of doing something different rather than just something that matches or syncs up, has complementary flavors with the food we're eating. So that's, I think I need to think of talking a little bit, so I think I did a little faster. One thing also to pay attention to if you're at a restaurant, if you're at a French restaurant and like for instance they don't have a whole lot of French wine on the menu, like if it's spring and they don't have a French rosé and you're at a French restaurant, that's a red flag. I would say that would be something to pay attention to. And it's amazing how many places you'll go in Boston and you'll see that that'll be the case. They'll be Spanish or Italian, and they won't have an extensive, what might be canonical sort of pairing or style of wine on the dish. And I think that's always something that I look for. Are they featuring Spanish? Are they featuring the wines of origin? Do they have a developed program? Do they have wines from not only Bordeaux and Burgundy, but from the Rhone and sort of lesser experiences? There's lots of ways of sort of assessing. You can really look. The wine program really is one way, probably one of the most initial ways that you can sort of assess the overall quality of the experience that you get. And it's just sort of an initial thing. You sit down, they hand you the wine list, whether it's just a short list for by the glass, or if it's a long one with both, 3 different menus. And sometimes, there's something grand about sitting down and you get 3 different menus, and it's sometimes a little overwhelming. And that's why I encourage you to sort of really start up that conversation with that server. Now, so this is kind of broadly speaking, and but I think this is an important way to we're getting towards the nitty-gritty of pricing. And if you're not aware, most of when you're at a restaurant, when you are ordering a glass of wine, the industry standard is that glass is covering the wholesale cost of the bottle. So if you're paying, broadly speaking, if the glass is $9, you can basically assume that bottle of wine cost about $9 a wholesale to the restaurant, and they're doing that just to cover the overall cost. And this is that's just one medium. It's not always the case. Sometimes places will give a little bit back. But this is just me speaking. I'm merely reciting industry standards, just so you can sort of use this as a rule of thumb, if you will, to sort of when you're assessing the experience. So with bottle pricing, they are typically the standard markup is that you can assume that the restaurant is doing about 3x the wholesale cost of that bottle. So that's why by that logic, then if you were to buy the average bottle of wine has about 5 glasses of wine, 5 healthy glasses. It makes more sense, obviously, to buy the bottle, because it's only 3 times the cost. Whereas if you were to buy 5 glasses of wine, you would be sort of doing it 5x. So that's just one more reason to go and order a bottle next time you're at a dinner. And generally speaking, I personally think that when you're at a restaurant, the wine bottle list is really where the person who is running the program is really able to strut his stuff and is really showing the collection and it's displaying their knowledge. And it's really where the gems and really the value is going to be found, is really more on that bottle list. This probably strikes me fairly obvious, but but I think it probably makes an important distinction when looking at scour that bottle list if you can, and look for, there's oftentimes, this is where the discounts are to be found, is really on the bottle list. Is, especially if you have any knowledge, and if you're the person doing the shopping for at the retail store, if you say, I saw that bottle of Opus One, they were selling at the local liquor store, was selling it for $200, and look at this restaurant, they've got it on their list for $250 or $275. That is a deal. There's no question about it. They are able to get you that. There are somehow, maybe they were able to get it at a deal for something, and that's generally speaking what you're looking for, I would say, is that sort of that overlap with that knowledge that you can expect to pay about 3 times what the establishment paid for. But with that said, like I said, this is very much an old school mentality, and it is still very much the norm. But there are a lot of restaurants that are experimenting with different methods of pricing structure to make it more economical to you. I know that some of my favorite places I'll talk to, she'll say, I've got a different mentality. I want to just do, just 2x markup. I want my bottles to move. I want people to see them, and I want them to say, hey, that's a deal. I'm going to do that. I'm going to go, because I'm more excited about that. I'm more excited about my bottles. And I'm less interested in my buy the glass. And generally speaking, I think the buy the glass option is meant to be a quick turn and burn. They're meant to be accessible. They're meant to be easy and not a lot of thought going on. But there isn't always the most amount of adventurousness going on involved with that.
Adam, one quick question. I think a lot of what we see is changes in vintages and how that can really affect price through things. I mean, can you talk a little bit about how vintage can maybe adjust prices or change the scope?
Yeah. I mean, so the one thing I do try to tell people is that when you are looking at a reserve list, do be forgiving of the restaurant if the vintage that is on the list is different from what you're seeing. It can be, this is one of the reasons why the waiter will come by and present the bottle to you and to allow you to check it and not just taste it. When they are, oftentimes a lot of people, I'm surprised how many people don't know this, but when you do order something and the bottle is brought to you and you're offered to taste, it's not to see if you like it per se, it's more just to look for flaws, if the wine is bad. They can return the bottle immediately. It allows just sort of people to, but vintages can be tricky in some regions more than others. Vintage is more tied to certain vintage variation, that is tied to certain regions more than others. It's more tied to places like Oregon, Burgundy, and certainly Bordeaux. But as you know, the world changes and climate change becomes more of a factor. Regions that were subject to vintage can be, be less subject to them. I know in Oregon has had really consistent flowering and really consistent vintages over the last few years. But I think what you're getting at, Andrew, is probably something different. It's probably more to do with the fact that this year you'll probably start noticing, as the rosés of this year start rolling into the stores, that a lot of that same rosé that you saw last year, or that you probably had for $10 to $12, is going to be about 15 to 16, and that is tied directly to with the tariffs that are ongoing from France and Italy. It's really, in some ways, it's an unprecedented situation from my generation, and that you're seeing sometimes as much as a 20 to 30% rise in prices. So that's one factor. Other things, certain producers have a really robust crop from one year, and then a bad one the next. And that will fluctuate the cost of the wine. You might be happy to know that 2018 was a really bumper crop in Napa, and for the first time in the entire time I've ever been working in the wine industry, the prices of Napa Cabernet are actually going to stabilize or go down, which is unusual. Usually they're almost always going up, usually consistently year in and year out. We are just starting most of the Napa stuff I see on the shelf is about 17, but we are going to start transitioning to the 18s pretty soon. Andrew, does that answer your question?
Yep.
Okay, great. All right. So I think that's a pretty. So one last thing I will say is that depending on where you're going, what kind of establishment you're going to, whether it be that should pad your expectations. Now that you kind of understand, broadly speaking, how markup will go, you can expect to see, if you go to a very tourism-driven place in the summertime, where they don't have a lot of regulars, and they're just trying to kind of crank through as much as they possibly can. I'm thinking like the North End here, or places that are close tied to seasonal sporting events. Though you should expect to see a sort of a greater padded markup. Just like when you would go to the movies, you would expect to pay more for popcorn. And conversely, if you go to a small local boutique-y kind of restaurant, you could expect that maybe they might be a little bit more flexible with you. They're going to treat you a little bit better. They're up with their prices. They're going to show, especially if you're a regular, you're going to show that. And I think this is a general kind of common theme that I'd like to sort of go back to, is that you'll have better experiences when the more relationships you develop with fellow connoisseurs, with fellow restaurateurs. They certainly oftentimes 1 to 2 people can often be a real gateway into whole broad experiences with both wine and food. And so you can expect to have that same experience if you're going to go to the big touristy driven spot. You're going to expect to see more big name brands at higher markups, depending on when you go to bigger venues that have higher rents, that have less of an established or regular clientele. So I think that's an important sort of aspect I'd like to sort of reiterate. The relationships are huge. I think at this point, I think I kind of like to shift gears a little bit. I think for time, we're almost just a brief talk about retail. The Massachusetts market is really separated into like kind of 3 different types of stores. That is like big box retailers, boutique shops, and your local packies. The big box retailers have probably been the most disruptive in recent years, where you sort of go in there and you see these crazy prices, especially versus relative to what you've been normally seeing. And this has been really disruptive for the market. It seems really amazing at first. And certainly to pay $5, $6 less for a bottle of wine that you're used to paying for, 17, and you get it for 12, or 10 and you're used to paying 15, can really be an impactful experience. but oftentimes what you're sacrificing, of course, for this is just really lack of customer service and lack of selection. I think when you go to big box retailers, you're going to see a broad selection of a lot of very similar products. You'll see 50 to 100 Napa Chardonnays, which are all effectively brands, and they are not necessarily if you did them in a blind tasting, most of us, including myself, would probably be hard pressed to sort of separate one from another. And where the little guy really capitalizes with this is, are there any brands that, so what is it, Andrew, what was the question? I couldn't quite read that. Are there any brands that you're excited about?
Are there any brands that are coming to market that you're excited about that you think would be good
Everything
value or great?
The Belmont Country Club wine list. No, well, I'm excited about a value. If I see something that I can recognize as at a good price. I mean, if it's a big name brand that I trust and I know that the price is fair, I get excited about that. Other brands that I'm more excited about. Regions and places and certain producers. I'm a big fan. I mean, I really like Bourgogne or Burgundy, as it's said in American in American or in English, or Bourgogne Rouge, as the French say. I'm excited about all things and really about the growers, the people that are really communicating a sense of place, people that are letting the land speak for themselves, and that is, I think, how do you find that? I mean, one of the ways you look for that is, if you look at the back of the label, are they just all flowery language? Are they giving you specific tech details? Are they talking about the vintage? Are they talking about specifics of their production? And there's actually not that many people do, actually. So this Zoom format is a little new to me, so I'm not used to the best simultaneously looking at the questions. You like a Pinot Noir? What is a similar Italian wine? The question is, can everybody see this, or is it just me who sees this? I'm not sort of sure.
And I think everybody.
Everybody can see it. Okay, so it's similar to Pinot Noir. Well, Pinot Noir can be grown in Italy. It's called Pinot Nero there, and other ones that are similar to it might be something like Galeoppo is a similar wine. Probably the closest analog to it would be Etna Rosso, which is found in Sicily. The name of the varietal here is Norello Mescalese. And if we wanted, we could sort of look at, I can send out an email after this that Andrew could forward to you all, just some basic notes about what we have for specific questions. The next question is, we were just in Spain and fell in love with Cava. I want to know your take on why pricing of Cava and Prosecco are so vastly different from French Champagne and why they're so similar in style. So Cava and Prosecco are actually very different products. Cava is from the Penedès region. It is often it is by law, it is a traditional method or method champenois, which means that the secondary fermentation happens in bottle, and that the bubbles actually occur at an individual level in each individual bottle. Whereas with Prosecco, the method of the secondary fermentation is called method Charmat, and they are essentially having the bubbles occur in a large tank, and then the juice is bubbled after the fact. So it's a very different method of production. It's not nearly as labor intensive, and Prosecco is probably I think it's overtaken. It's probably one of the most popular sparkling wine in the world at this point. They've expanded production tremendously, and there's a lot of diversity within it. I would say if you're looking for quality Prosecco, look for DOCG Prosecco. That is denomination, or forgive me, I can't really quite remember the exact. I won't go into the Italian of it, but DOCG is the highest level of quality set by the Italian government. And then Cava, of course, being from Spain, is usually made with indigenous Spanish varietals. and can be actually large production too. But there's generally speaking a lot more interesting things happening with smaller producers. And champagne and sparkling, we could do a whole class on sparkling and champagne too if we wanted, but broadly speaking, that's going to be the big differences. Why is champagne so expensive? It's a monopoly like not unlike De Beers. The major, it's controlled by basically 7 or 8 major houses who intentionally raise the price of it year in and year out. Now, do they have a special product? They absolutely do. Is it just a little bit better than everything else? Absolutely. But have they gotten greedy? They certainly have to some degree. But with that said, I love champagne, and there's nothing quite in the world like champagne. All right. Why does a waiter? Is there any difference in quality between a screw top and a corked wine? Oh, I love this question. Broadly speaking, no. There is really no. If anything, actually, a screw cap enclosure is a more secure and quality enclosure than a cork. But the reason why we still are using cork is, well, for one thing, the government of Portugal wants us to keep using cork because all the cork comes from a certain collection of trees in forest in Portugal. But more importantly, this is important too when you're at a restaurant and a waiter comes by and does this, or if he does this, does the song, pop. You hear the pop. What's more romantic? What do? Who doesn't love the pop? We don't want to give up the pop. That's the truth. I mean, the truth of the matter is we just love the romance of the cork. We love the ceremony of overing the cork. And there is there is an argument to be made that when you're laying wine down, this very small amount of oxygen that comes in through the cork over time may positively, advantageously age the wine appropriately. Whereas when you have a screw cap, it is completely inert. It is not adding anything to the wine over time. And we really actually don't know if the cork will, or the screw cap will, over time, because they haven't been out that long, whether or not they'll do anything negative to the wine. But most people are still aging fine wine in cork, particularly the French and the Italians. They're so traditional. They're so set in their ways. They do not want to change that. To greater or lesser positive results.
I'm trying to ask a question, a chat, but it's not going through.
Well, just ask your question, my dear.
I like reds, and I had Chateau Bechevel many years ago, which was my favorite of all time. What am I looking for now? What is it? What was it? Chateau Bechevel. Are you familiar with that?
I am familiar with Chateau Bechevel. Chateau Bechevel is, I believe, a third growth wine from Saint-Julien. Actually, it was one of my favorite. That was one of my first aha moments with wine. Was not Bechevel, but Amiral de Bechevel was. It was in 1989. I think we were drinking it around 2008, and it was wonderful. It was unlike anything. So I guess I don't quite understand the question. What is it?
I wanted to replicate that. What is it? Is it a Beaujolais?
No, that's a Bordeaux. Oh, that's a Bordeaux.
Bordeaux.
So that not only is that a Bordeaux, that is a sub-region of Bordeaux called Saint-Julien. That's S-E-S-T period.
Julien. Yeah.
Julien. Typically, the blend with those wines is about 60% Cabernet and 40% Merlot, they're really one of the great regions. That's a left bank Bordeaux. It's Saint-Julien is part of the Médoc, and that the Médoc encompasses that whole left side of the left bank of Bordeaux, and that's really where arguably some of the best wines in the world are from.
So I'm looking at a label, and I'm looking for any of those words.
I'm sorry?
If I'm looking at the label, I'm looking for any of those buzzwords.
You're looking for Bechevel, obviously, but Saint-Julien, particularly Saint-Julien. I'd point you to another wine called Lagrange. I think is another important one. It's Lagrange. That's another Saint-Julien that I'm quite fond of. And yeah, I think I can't call it any others at the time, but Saint-Julien, that's what you're looking for. Saint-Julien, particularly with probably about a few years of bottle age on it. You probably have at least 5 years of bottle age on it. So if you're getting maybe a 2015 at least, that's when I'd probably want to start at the very earliest drinking.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I can't seem to get this question to go.
All
Thank
right.
you for answering it.
Moving on. Kava. So we went to that one. This is something I wanted to talk wine. We didn't really talk too much about wine retail. Similar basic ideas. Develop relationships with your favorite local retailer. Listen to this is important. Talk to the guy who listens, not just the guy who wants to sell you something. There are people. There are two different types of wine sales people. Generally, people who just want to sell you what they're excited about, or there are people who want to listen to you and understand what your palate's about. I would go find the retailer that's going to do that for you and is going to talk to you about what you like, not necessarily what they're into. Scores and reviewers are really tricky. They've become an effective way of selling wine. I don't necessarily think they're really helpful for the consumer. The methods of assessment are sometimes opaque. They're done on a point system, which is not necessarily grading how the wine tastes. They are assessing how good it is of an example of that particular type. So this would be great if it would mean absolutely nothing if you had like a sort of a Brunello di Montalcino that got 97 to 99 points, and you didn't like big tannic firm reds that needed tons of food, really big food. You didn't like big hearty food to drink. If you liked delicate wines with a delicate sensibility, you wouldn't like that 97 or 98 point wine because the critic or the reviewer is not assessing taste. He's assessing how well that wine performed versus other wines in its set for a particular year. The best way I'd say to looking at scores, if you really want to go down that route, would be to pick a critic and stick with it, and look at, when you're looking at the shelf talkers, or the literature on the shelf, it says 91 points Anthony Galloni or 91 points James Suckling. Stick with that guy and see if he matches up to the way you think about the wine. Because a lot of these retailers will really use any sort of reviewer at all. There's a whole cottage industry of quack reviewers that are just to generate points that are practically meaningless. Andrew actually mentioned I should probably talk about Vivino. I think it's a great little app. Unlike the critics, Vivino is not about critical praise. It's really just an aggregate collection of consumer reviews that allows. It's an app that allows you to store wine reviews and store bottles of wine that you've tried. You just basically snap a picture of a bottle, and it will link you to that page, and it will tell the aggregate score of people who have drunk the wine that are like yourselves and what they thought about it. And if you can develop a profile for yourself, and you can sort of have a collection of wines that you've tried and create a database for yourself within the app, and it's a nice way to store that and remember what you've tried, and keep it, because Lord knows it's very easy to quickly forget how good your experience and what it was you were drinking when we've had those nights. It certainly happened to all of us, for sure. Let's see. Vivino, I like Vivino. Okay. So why does the waiter put the cork down on the table after opening it? And should you inspect it? It's part of the ritual, of the wine drinking process, of the showmanship, if you will. There are certain things you might want to look for when you're buying wine. So if they leave a cork on the table, and if it's this is somewhat of an old one, but sometimes you'll see little crystals will actually form on the end of the bottle, and that's actually nothing to be scared of. That is tartaric acid that has built up over time, and it happens naturally. If the wine really has any acidity, it's actually probably a good sign that the wine has this acid in it. We like acid in wines to provide structure. So that's something fun. If they have it, that can be fun. It can be something fun to look for. One thing you do want to look, one indication that the wine might be flawed will be that if you will see the wine has penetrated, has seeped through all the way to the very tip. If you can see sort of a failing of the cork on the side, you can see the wine has been stored on its side. It might sort of creep up all the way to the very, very top of the cork. But basically, even if it's short of the top of the cork at all, the wine should be fine. It might have been close to failing, but unless it sort of just exceeded that, and even if it did, it might not be stored long enough for it to have any adverse effects. I mean, most of the wine that we get is consumed within, I think there's a statistic that said that basically about 95% of all wine is consumed within 45 minutes of purchase. So I know that's certainly been the case lately. But yeah, let's see. What's the deal with Super Tuscans? Do you prefer pure grapes, or are blends really good as well? What are the best rosés? So Super Tuscans emerged about in the late 80s as a way for the Italian winemakers along the Tuscan coast to basically flout the laws of the Italian government and saying, so this is kind of goes back to a general theme that France is about tradition and about structure and about making the best possible wine within a very specific, time-tested, rigid code that they've nailed the methods of production and they know what they're doing, and you're just trying to do that. The Italians don't believe in any of that. The Italians are about creativity. They want to be able to do what they want to do. And the Super Tuscans came about as a result of the fact that the Italian government was saying all Tuscan wine has to be made this way. It has to be made to fit the Chianti Classico methods, the Chianti method. And the truth is the original recipe for Chianti was very bad. It was coined by this legendary Duke who called for people to put a minimum amount of, I think, 20% white wine in a red wine. And you can imagine if a wine is 20% white wine and it's supposed to be a red wine, it's probably going to be thin and not very good. So there was a lot of bad Chianti around the 80s and the late 90s, and there were a set of particular producers along the coast of Tuscany in the particular area called Bolgheri, and that's Bolghiri, I believe. And they basically set about to make, they were making essentially $100 and $200 bottles of wine retail that had a simple vin de table designation from the Italian government. And nobody had ever seen anything like this before. And it turned a number of critics' heads and it became a thing. And so now what's that evolved into is that now basically if it's anything from Tuscany that is made with anything other than Sangiovese, it's now a Super Tuscan. So it's a term that is wildly thrown about, mostly for marketing purposes at this point. But when in truth, the real Super Tuscans are going to be $100 or more retail on the shelf. And a Super Tuscan, a true Super Tuscan, is essentially an Italian wine that is made with French grapes, that is Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, and it's aged in small barriques or small barrels, and it's made from these very prestigious houses. But so what that has emerged into or evolved into is that you have essentially cheap Cabernet blended with cheap Sangiovese, and a lot of producers calling them Super Tuscans. I hate to be sort of negative, but that's broadly speaking what it is sort of turned into. Yeah.
So how do you know if you're looking at a wine shelf, what's a true Super Tuscan versus what's a, camouflage cheap wine? Well,
I mean, so the big Super Tuscans they're big names. You've probably heard of them. They're names like Ornellaia. They're names like Tignanello. Those are like the original Super Tuscans, but it's a good question. I would say there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with a lot of these wines are really great. I mean, they're tasty wines. But are they what they said they were? What the original hubbub was about? They're really not. They're often just sort of like simple table wines that are made with non-traditional Italian Italian varietals like Sangiovese or indigenous Italian varietals. So what it's emerged, broadly speaking, is to say is like wines that are made from varietals that are from things that are not grown in Italy normally. Is there a way to, broadly speaking, try which ones are, to know which ones are better than others? I mean, you know, you can expect to have I think the better thing is to look at what is the varietal that is used. Sangiovese, if it's predominantly Sangiovese, which is like, you know, the quintessential Central Italian varietal, it's going to be kind of medium bodied. It's going to be somewhat acidic. And if it's blended with things like Merlot and Cabernet, it's going to have a little bit more of that dark fruit, a little bit more of that sexy sort of voluptuousness and softness, which a lot of, frankly, the American palate has sort of come to look for in wines, is that sort of soft, supple, silky fruit to kind of moderate the sort of more aggressive Italian style, which sometimes Sangiovese can be kind of thin and kind of sharp and kind of tannic at times. You know, I think you know, it's a good question. You know, I think you can expect to have I would say around, I'd say $15, I think, is a fair price to pay for a decent bottle of wine. I think for me, the sweet spot is somewhere between $15 and $30 a bottle on the shelf to have a really, that is at a retailer, to have a really, you can have a really remarkable experience at some point between that range. And, you know, depending on how you feel about the wine, this is where that sort of QPR comes in. You spend a little bit of money on it, whether it be 15 or 25 or 30. I think if you're spending more than 30 to 35 or 50, you're expecting a certain, that's where you really can start to split hairs. And really, that's when you start getting into super premium quality price points, and you really start to really assess the wine. And but I think you can have a really great experience, and I really do that, meaning that a really transcendent experience for, you know, 15 to 30, and I certainly expect that after 35, 40, 50 bucks. You know, you're looking for things of a really extraordinary experience, I think, when you're going $35, $50 a bottle, for sure. Yeah. So the best rosés. Ooh, that's a. I don't want to offend anybody, you know. So I've been all the wines that I sell, you know. Dry. I'm a big fan of dry French rosé. I think things from the style which has dominated the industry is the French Provençal style that is from the Mediterranean coast and the south of France, right around Marseille. In Provence, one of the most beautiful places in the world, where they have about 300 days of sunshine a year. These are typically blended. They have that sort of light salmon pink color. And those wines tend to be my favorite styles for rosé. I particularly like a house called Peyrasol. That is Peyrasol. It's imported by a gentleman named Neil Rosenthal. And that's another way to look at, to think about when you're buying wine is pay attention to the importer, particularly if it's international. Importers tend to acquire wines that match their palates, and maybe you explore the wines. You see they have generally recognizable labels on the back label that say this person imported this, and if you can, they generally have sort of themes and styles that kind of overlap across all their producers, and you might find yourself liking this portfolio or this collection that that an importer has developed. And some importers are really good at what they do. They're the true masters of collecting producers that sort of fall in line with their philosophies about wine and their philosophies about how wine should taste. It says Belmont, where's the best store in the Boston area? So besides Belmont, where is the best store in the Boston area to buy wine? So I'm biased in this way. I have a certain account list, and I do call on full disclosure. I call on Joel Berman at Berman's, and they're one of my favorite people to deal with. They're right down the street from you. Certainly some of the most prestigious or sort of biggest and most important retailers that I don't call on would be places like Gordon's, Marty's. These guys are still independent, even though they're not, and they're locals, even though they are not small companies at this point. and they're not owned by out-of-staters with large connections or important connections in Washington. Think Total Wine. So yeah, those are some of my favorites. That's yeah. Are there any importers that I particularly? Are there any importers that I particularly like? That would be so. I like Neil Rosenthal. I like Kermit Lynch. I like Vintage 59. I think Vintage 59 is a nice collection of mostly French wines. Those are people to pay attention to. Neil Rosenthal he's a guy who was sort of led the natural wine movement back in the late 70s and early 80s. And Kermit Lynch is another one who sort of sought out traditional method producers who are doing the old ways. They're stamping on the grapes with their feet. They're fermenting in barrel and things of that nature. So the question is, what is your take on sulfites in wine or organic wines free of sulfites? The answer is that organic wines are always going to have sulfites in them. Because sulfites are a natural product of the fermentation process, but it's not really something you have to worry about particularly. You get about 10 times more sulfites with a single 6-ounce glass of OJ, and you get about 200 times more sulfites when you eat a single piece of dried fruit. If you are eating dried fruit when you're doing sulfites. So the reason why all wines on the bottle say this wine contains sulfites is because I think it was back in the 70s, there was a small child who was exposed to a glass of wine at dinner, and unbeknownst to the parents, he had a terrible sulfite allergy, and he ended up having some pretty serious side effects as a result of it. And so there was a lawsuit, and the FCC basically said that you had to put that all wine had sulfites in it. There is a movement to reduce sulfites dramatically, and organic wines definitely have fewer sulfites in them. But most of the sulfites happen at time of bottling, and they just act as a slight preservative in the wine to stabilize it for the shelf life. I generally don't think you have anything to worry about with and some people think that they have an adverse relationship to sulfites. I think more often they have an adverse relationship to histamines in wine. Red wine particularly has some histamines in it, which can cause allergic reactions. And this has led a lot of people to thinking that they are allergic to red wine or sulfites, but it's merely just because there's sort of polyphenolic content in the red wine, which might be causing that. I don't know.
Adam, if I could just ask you a couple questions, seeing how everybody on this call is suffering through a pandemic as well.
Yeah.
If you were going to cook Mrs. Dixon dinner and have a nice salmon dinner, what would be your $15 to $30 go-to wine that you would pair with salmon?
That's a great call. So for salmon, I'd probably go with a sort of a very light-bodied, and so this is important too. If I was going to cook it, I might pan sear it with some capers, some chili peppers, and some lemon, some citrus. And then cooking methods can really be an important aspect of pairing. And I'd probably go with something a really delicate red wine. A particular very delicate red wine, like a Pinot Noir, and not just any Pinot Noir, something from like Loire Valley, something from Alsace, something like a delicate Italian red, maybe like an inexpensive Barbera or something like that. That would go really nice with some nice acidity in all of those wines, and the body of the red would just be a nice sort of complement. For me, when I'm pairing, I think the most important thing I think of is that the weight of the wine really matches the weight of the dish, and that most chefs will probably agree that is probably one of the more important factors. It's not the only factor, but that the generally perceived weight of the wine in your mouth, that is the body of the wine, will match the perceived weight of the dish that you're preparing. And of course, methods of food production can enhance or degrade the weight of the dish. So like, for instance, if you boiled the chicken or you boiled the salmon, it would have a very different texture and weight than if you were to sort of slow roast it, for instance, and add glaze and sort of various sauces to it. So yeah.
And just to jump ahead of Joe Pereski here, because I know he's going to want to ask the question, if you had a nice roasted half chicken, what would
Right.
you know, if you went and you got a roasted half chicken, just sort of a plain roasted half chicken, what would you
Roasted half
recommend for that?
chicken. Oh, man. You know, that's a fun one. I mean, that's just such a classic. You can do so much with that. You know, it might be a little, might be a little bit of a heresy here, but I might just go with like a nice simple Rhone wine or a simple Bordeaux, like an AOC Bordeaux. Nothing too fancy. Maybe something around, you know, like a Côte du Rhône Village, from even actually not even that ripe of a year, and something that maybe was organically farmed and not aged for too long in oak. That would be something that I would go with for sure. Yeah, something like that. Maybe like, and or if you wanted a white wine, and I think chicken is one of those things you could do red and white with chicken. It's depending on how you prepare it. If you do it, well, because it's oven roasted and you've got probably a lot of things going on in there, you could really have fun with it. If you weren't going to do red, I'd probably go with, if you wanted to spend a little more money, maybe you'd go with maybe with like a Chardonnay, a French Chardonnay, like a Burgundy, a white Burgundy, like a Macon Chardonnay. That would be quite nice. I typically don't like oak Chardonnay with food. I think oak can often have a kind of a clashing kind of effect to it. I like sort of cleaner Chardonnays. Although the one exception to that is where if you're getting lobster, definitely get oak Chardonnay with lobster. Get a lot of butter, get a lot of lobster, and get an oaky Chardonnay. That's a killer pairing right there for sure.
Okay, I'll hit you with one more, and then we can open it up for questions. I also know that the Reddies really like spicy food, so they like more of a Mexican style food or something like that. If you're eating a Thai food or something,
spicy wine is really tricky, because you know, really what happens with spice is that it's actually really one of the more challenging pairings to do, because oftentimes the spice will interact with the tannin, and it just spice and tannin, they come together and they just eliminate every other aspect of the wine that you're tasting. It's like you get that structure and you get that brittle metallic kind of taste, and you get that pepper, and that's basically all that you can taste. If you were going to do with spice, actually I typically like to do sweeter wines, like a sweeter Riesling, something to offset the heat, especially if it has any sort of serious you know, spice and heat to it. You do really want to have something that has a little bit of residual sugar to cool off the spice of it, and I think that's a really important thing to remember. Otherwise, you know, that can work with red or whites. But it's often easier to find a sweet white than it is a good sweet white than it is a good sweet red. There's a lot of cheap sweet red that isn't very good out there.
And I do see we have a member question, which is, if you were to be preparing a dish with Dijon mustard, I'm guessing like a Dijon mustard salmon or chicken or something like that, which would be a good idea for a Cooking with Andrew link maybe.
That's okay. So a Dijon mustard. Let's see. Well, it's something from Dijon, maybe. You know, like a good red Burgundy, maybe. That could. I mean, so the food of Dijon and Burgundy, you know, is sort of classically simple. It's roast chicken. It's lots of butter. You know, it's bread. You know, it's very so, you know, so generally speaking, with the broad speed, you would go with simple food, complex wine, complex food, simple wine. So, you know, you can really have fun with that's really where you can actually spend a lot of money and sort of go where you're actually, it's very easy to do that is when you're going into Burgundy or Bordeaux and you're getting these really complex wines that are crazy. So that's if you want the great experience. You know, if not, I mean, just like I said, like a little simple Côte du Rhône would work. Maybe like an inexpensive Nebbiolo. That would be something like from the Piedmont. Yeah, like a Nebbiolo d'Alba, something like that. That could work. Especially if you had any, because you've got a certain kind of bitter component to the Dijon, and we'd want to talk. We'd have to delve a little bit more into how we're preparing this, how we're using the Dijon. I feel like, you know.
noticed you're talking only about French wines. You haven't mentioned any American wine.
Maybe I'm revealing my prejudices. I tend to drink more French, but there are some American wines that I think are quite good. And actually, the American wines are really like a guilty pleasure for me. They're really just delicious on their own. They don't often. We've been talking a lot about food, and I think food is more intimately associated with food and wine. Are often talked about as one in Europe, whereas in America we tend to think of wine as something that can be enjoyed on its own. It's not necessarily thought of as being paired with food. So that's probably one of the reasons for that, I would say. Yeah.
Perfect. Does anybody else have any
Okay.
questions for Adam, sort of as we wrap up? No? Well,
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very informative.
Thank you.
Any vintages you particularly think are great buys right now?
15 Bordeaux is great. The 16 Tuscany, 16 Chianti is great. 17 Chianti had a really tough year. Generally speaking, the tariffs are going to hit wine prices, particularly that $10 to $20 range, particularly hard this year. So look for things that are maybe have been on the shelf for a year or two that might be, they're probably still good, particularly of good quality. So because some of them you're going to see some pretty steep price increases. No more than like 20 or 30%, but even so, that can make a 20 or 30% of $10 is $3. So that's a different price point, isn't it?
Yep.
So.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Sure.
All right, guys, thanks.
great. Hopefully we'll see everybody at the club soon. If not, we have another class next week. We'd love to have you join us. Mike will have links if you are interested. I think it's bourbon next week, I believe. But we'll send you a link and a reminder. And if you have any, if you think of any questions for Adam, or you need a recommendation for pizza night or s'mores or something like that, we can throw him some curveballs and see what he comes up with. So appreciate seeing everybody, and hopefully we'll see you
Guys,
again
thank you
soon.
all for joining. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
Fun to
Great
see
job,
you all.
Adam.
You
Thank
too.
you.